There's this clay prism, a single list. It says kings once ruled for tens of thousands of years. That's the Sumerian King List. And that impossible timeline ties directly into a story. A story of a great flood. A story that shows up all over the world. So you have these ancient scribes writing about rulers who reigned for millennia. And you have this flood, this cataclysmic deluge. It becomes the pivotal moment in their history, the turning point. And then you have to ask cultures across the globe, all remembering the same overwhelming event. What does that mean? It's a 4,000-year-old puzzle, one that blurs the line between myth and memory. The question is really what is truly remembered in our oldest stories. This list, it wasn't found whole. It was fragments, broken pieces of baked clay, lying in the dirt of Mesopotamia for centuries. Until an archaeologist's brush uncovered one, and there were the marks, cuneiform, pressed into the clay with a reed stylus thousands of years ago, and they found copies. Several of them in different cities like Nippur and Lhasa, which meant it was known, it was important, but the most complete version, the famous one, is the Weld-Blundell prism. A small, four-sided clay prism. You could hold it, feel the weight, the coolness of the baked earth. This wasn't a casual note, it was deliberate, a formal record. And its creation had a purpose beyond just keeping records. In the ancient world, history was power, so a king would commission this to anchor his own rule in a timeline. A timeline that went back to the dawn of civilization, and further back to a time ruled by beings who lived for immense lengths. The message was, my authority isn't new. It's part of a chain, an unbroken divine lineage, one that survived even the greatest catastrophe. This list was a political tool, propaganda, written in clay. To legitimize the ruler by connecting him to the antediluvian sovereigns, the kings who came before the flood. So before you even read a single reign length, the artifact itself whispers something. This is a story about origins, about survival, and about a need, the human need to root power in a timeless past, and within that past the narrative turns. It takes a sharp, dramatic turn. The cuneiform script starts with something very simple. Kingship came down from heaven, and it landed in Eridu. That's the first line. It's not a record of something that happened. It's a statement. Authority didn't come from people. It was a gift sent down to that first city, and with that, the whole story is framed. Human history is tied to the gods, and the king is their instrument. That opening sets the tone. This isn't an account book. It's a sacred lineage of rule. Then the list finds its pattern, a city, then a king, then how long he ruled, but the numbers aren't in years, not like we count them. They're in units called sars and ners. A sar was 3,600 years, a ner was 600. So when it says the first king, Alulim, ruled Eridu for 8 sars, that's 28,800 years. The next king ruled for 10 sars, 36,000 years. These aren't lifespans, they're eras, lengths of time that belong to myth or to a different idea of time. A scholar, Thorkild Jacobsen, he spent his life on these texts. He saw this not as fact but as a deep cultural memory. Those huge spans meant a primordial age, a beginning when the world was new and rulers were near the divine. This goes on for the first 8 kings across 5 cities, reigns that stretch for tens of thousands of years, and then the list does something. It pauses. It puts in one line, then the flood swept over. Everything before that is one world. Everything after is another. The break is total. After the flood, the list starts again. But the numbers shift. They're still long, sometimes centuries, but now it's hundreds of years, not tens of thousands. They start to vaguely match what we might see as possible dynasties. That structure is the first big question. Two clear epochs of history split by one catastrophic event. The flood is the reset. It divides the age of the gods from the age of men. By putting it right there in the King List, the Sumerians were saying this was the pivotal event, the hinge everything turned on. So that flood, what was it? And why did that story resonate not just there, but everywhere in the ancient world? 241,200 years. That's how long those 8 kings ruled before the flood. It's a length of time that just stops meaning anything to a person. The first king was Ululim in Eridu, and his reign was 28,800 years. You see a number like that, and the story changes. This isn't history, it's something else. So what are these spans? Did the scribes think we'd believe a man lived that long? Probably not. The numbers had another job. One thought is they stand for dynasties. Ululim's reign might be his whole line, his city's era, folded into one name. Or it's astronomy. The Sumerians used base 60. Their long years could match celestial cycles, tying kings to the movement of the sky, making them part of a cosmic order. But maybe it's symbolic. These huge reigns lift the pre-flood kings into another kind of time, a golden age, when the world was new, gods were close, and time moved differently. Their archetypes, founding heroes, their rule length means stability, divine favor, a primordial perfection. Theirs is the before, a long, dreamlike prologue. Then the flood comes and everything changes. The kings after the deluge have reigns you can almost grasp. 600 years, 390, still long, but a sharp drop from the tens of thousands. The list shows this shift, a descent from the mythic into something closer to human dynasties, from god kings to hero kings, then to mortal kings. That compression is the list's real story. It uses numbers to tell of loss and a new start. The flood was a filter. It washed away the old world of immense rulers and began a harder age, where human lifespans, human reigns, became painfully finite. The list doesn't just state it, you feel it in the drop between those columns of numbers, and that makes the flood the great turning point, a reset for all civilization. But why does this story appear everywhere, across cultures, oceans, mountains? The answer isn't in one list. It's in a chorus of ancient voices, all singing the same haunting song. The King List has that line, the flood swept over the earth. It's a door, you open it, and you're in a world of storm. The Sumerians didn't just note it, they told the story. In the Eridu Genesis, the gods were weary of humanity's noise, the growth. They held a council. Enlil, the chief god, argued for a final solution, a flood. To wipe the slate clean, to return the world to silence, but not all the gods agreed. Enki, the god of wisdom, he saw it as a terrible waste, so he found a loophole. He couldn't defy the council, not directly, but he could warn one man. He went to the wall of a reed hut where the king Ziusudra slept, and he spoke not to the man but to the wall. A ruse to bypass his oath, he told the wall of the coming deluge. He said to build a great boat to gather his family, to bring the seed of all living creatures aboard. So Ziusudra built the vessel. For 7 days the storm raged. The text describes a darkness so complete you could not see another person. The gods themselves trembled at the fury they'd unleashed. For 7 days and nights the flood swept over until every human work was swallowed. Then it stopped. Ziusudra opened a window on the boat and wept. He saw a world return to a flat, watery waste. He sent out birds, a dove, a swallow. They found no place to rest, but he sent a raven, and it did not return. So he knew the waters had receded. The boat came to rest on a mountain, and in gratitude he made an offering to the gods. They gathered around the sweet smell of the sacrifice. Enlil, initially furious to see survivors, was placated. Instead of punishment, Ziusudra was granted a gift, eternal life. He and his wife were taken to live in the distant, blessed land of Dilmun. They became immortal. That story is powerful on its own. Divine conflict, human ingenuity, a second chance. But its power multiplies when you place it back into the King List. The list doesn't give you the drama, the reed hut, the weeping. It just states the fact, then the flood swept over. That simple line now carries the weight of the entire epic. It transforms the list from a dry chronicle into a document of cosmic history. The flood is the definitive divider, the reset button. Everything before it belongs to the mythic age. The age of impossibly long reigns when gods walked closer to earth. Everything after is our world, the human age, shorter lives, fragile kingdoms. By embedding this cataclysmic event as the central pivot of their record, the Sumerians made their point. This happened, it changed everything, and we, the people of the cities that came after, we are the children of that survival. But this story, a great flood, a single saved family. It doesn't belong only to Mesopotamia. If you listen, you can hear its echo in 100 other ancient cultures, all asking the same haunting question. The story of Ziusudra stayed alive. It moved. Centuries later, Babylon told it again. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero looks for life's secret from a man named Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim tells him a story, gods deciding to send a flood, being warned to build a boat, sending out birds to find land. The details are nearly the same. The same narrative bones, just in a different cultural skin. Then you look west to the Hebrew Bible and Noah, a righteous man, an ark, a flood covering the highest mountains, a covenant made with a rainbow. The parallels are too strong to ignore, but the echoes keep going. In ancient Greece, they spoke of Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. They survive a flood sent by Zeus. They repopulate the earth by casting stones behind them. In Hindu tradition, the sage Manu is warned by a fish, a coming deluge. He builds a ship to preserve life. Indigenous stories from the Americas tell of a great flood, a canoe, a raven or a muskrat bringing back mud. Even in Chinese mythology, the engineer Yu is famous for controlling devastating floods that once covered the land. This isn't a coincidence, it's a chorus of memory sung by cultures separated by continents and oceans. So the question shifts. It's no longer if our ancestors remembered a cataclysmic flood. The stories are everywhere. The question becomes why? Why is this memory so universal? So deeply etched into the human story? What event could have been that vast, that traumatic, that it became a foundational part of who we are? This is where the myth meets the earth. Geologists and historians look for a kernel of truth. One idea points to the end of the last ice age. The great glaciers melted around 10,000 years ago. Global sea levels rose dramatically, coastlines vanished. What were once fertile plains became ocean floors overnight. For the people living there, it would have been an apocalypse. Water, relentless and unstoppable, swallowing their world. Another theory focuses on Mesopotamia itself. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they're prone to catastrophic, basin-wide flooding. A series of unimaginably bad seasons, or a single perfect storm of weather and geography, could have drowned the entire cradle of civilization. The flood would have been local. But for the people there, it was their entire world. The trauma would be absolute, and from that localized catastrophe, the story spread, with trade, migration, oral tradition. Adapting to new lands but keeping its core intact. This is what makes the Sumerian King List so compelling. It doesn't just tell the flood story as a standalone myth. It embeds this universal, traumatic memory directly into its formal chronology. It uses that event as the central hinge of history. Before the flood, time was immense. Godlike, after the flood, time became human, measured, fragile. The list presents the flood not as a legend, but as the definitive turning point. It urges us to listen. To consider that within all those global stories, there might be a real geological sigh. A moment when the earth shifted, waters rose, and humanity's story was split into a before and an after. The King List gives that moment a name, a place, a consequence. It turns a whispered global memory into a dated entry in humanity's oldest ledger, that line between history and myth. It's the most interesting part of all this. For more than a century, scholars have looked at the same list, and they've seen two completely different things. Most archaeologists and historians, that's the mainstream view. They see the King List as political fiction, a kind of tapestry, woven from real memory and pure invention. The kings after the flood, the later ones, their names often match other records. Gilgamesh of Uruk, he's on the list. He was a real ruler, a powerful king. His legend just grew over centuries, so the list uses these known kings to anchor itself in reality. Then it builds a bridge backward from them. It invents a deeper past. Those pre-flood rulers, the ones with impossible reigns, they're likely symbolic archetypes. They connect the human dynasties, the historical ones, all the way back. Back to the moment kingship descended from heaven. It creates an unbroken chain from the gods through the flood down to the king who had the prism made. This wasn't unique to Sumer. Inventing a glorious ancestry was common. A ruler's power was magnified by the weight of the past he could claim. So in this reading, the list isn't a lie. It's a document of cultural truth. It tells us what the Sumerians believed about the structure of time, about the divine source of authority. It's their way of making sense of their place. In a vast cosmic story, then there's the other interpretation, far more controversial. This view takes the numbers at face value. What if the reigns were recorded exactly as intended? What if 28,800 years meant precisely that? This leads to speculative ideas, a lost epoch, an age before our own where beings of immense longevity existed. Perhaps an advanced civilization that guided humanity, or it suggests our ancestors had a different relationship with time, measuring it in cycles we no longer understand. This view isn't supported by conventional archaeology, but its persistence is telling. It speaks to a deep intuition that our past might hold forgotten chapters. That these immense numbers aren't just fantasy, they're a distorted memory of something real, a memory so old it's stretched into the realm of the mythic. The truth is probably in the space between. The Sumerian King List is a palimpsest. That's a manuscript where old writing is scraped away to write something new. But traces of the original remain beneath. This list is like that. The later layers show real kings, real cities, real conflicts, but beneath them, in those pre-flood entries, you see the ghostly imprint of something else. Maybe the idealized memory of founding chieftains, their reigns blown up to legendary proportions, or the incorporation of older, oral traditions about a time when the world was different. Our task isn't to choose one side, it's to hold both possibilities, to see the list as its creators might have, a sacred document where fact and symbol merged. To tell the only story that mattered, the story of where they came from and how they survived. To understand that story fully, you have to look past the kings and the numbers. To the world they ruled, you have to ask, what was life actually like in those first cities? What did it mean to be a king in the dawn of time? The list was never just a record. It was a weapon. Power in Mesopotamia was a constant contest. Cities like and Uruk and Isin, they rose and they fell. Rulers were locked in that struggle. And authority didn't come just from armies. It didn't come just from wealth. It came from the past. The deeper your roots, the more legitimate your throne. And what root is deeper than one that goes back before the flood itself? That's the engine of the Sumerian King List. It wasn't compiled by historians. It was commissioned by kings to answer one question: why should you obey me? The answer was written in clay: because my line goes back to the dawn of time. Because the gods gave kingship to my ancestors, because my rule isn't new. It's the restoration of an ancient divine order. This was propaganda in cuneiform. A piece of statecraft that used myth to control the present. You can see the strategy. Take the fall of Ur around 2000 BC. Its dynasty collapsed. Chaos followed, then a new power rose, Isin. Its kings faced a problem. They were newcomers. Their claim to rule all of Sumer was shaky, so they seized the narrative. They became the custodians of Sumerian culture, and they commissioned copies of the King List, but not just any copy, a version that arranged the succession of cities to lead, inevitably, to Isin. It positioned them as the rightful heirs, the legitimate successors to the kings of Ur, and by extension, to all the kings before the flood. The list was their certificate. It said, "We are not usurpers, we are the next link in a chain that goes back to heaven." This is where the flood narrative served its purpose. That cataclysm wasn't just a disaster. It was a political gift. It created a clean break in history. Everything before the flood was a lost mythic age. Everything after was a new beginning. So any dynasty rising after a collapse could position itself not as a replacement, but as a restoration. A fresh start, still blessed by the gods. By including the flood as the central pivot, the King List provided a reset button. A ruler could say, the old order is gone, washed away, but the principle of kingship bestowed by the gods before the flood survived, and now it has landed on me. My rule is the new chapter in that story, so when you hold that clay prism, you're not just holding names and numbers, you're holding a founding document. A constitution. It transforms local legends and half-remembered chiefs into a sacred national history. It turns myth into a tool for unity and control. This blending of memory, cosmology, and political need shows us the Sumerians weren't just recording their past. They were building it, crafting a story so powerful, so rooted in the divine, that to question the king's authority was to question the order of the cosmos. But to wield that power, you needed more than a story. You needed a system, a way to make the myth tangible, to embed it into daily life and cosmic belief. Those immense numbers, they're a kind of code. 28,800 years, 36,000 years. To us, that's fantasy. But for the Sumerians, a culture built on watching the sky, on complex math, those numbers likely meant something else. They weren't random, they were symbolic, a sacred geometry written in time. Take that first reign, Elulem's 28,800 years. Divide it by their base number, 60, you get 480, a clean, round figure in their system. And then, 28,800 is also 144 times 200. The number 144 had significance. It shows up later in Babylonian astronomy. That's not coincidence, it's design. The number 36,000 is even more telling. It's 100 times 360, a clear echo of the solar year. These figures are playing with cosmic cycles. There's a compelling theory. It points to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, a cycle that takes about 26,000 years. The Sumerians were meticulous astronomers. They may have observed its effects over centuries. Could those huge reign lengths be an attempt to encode this grand celestial clock, to tie the rule of their first kings to the very turning of the heavens? It's a profound thought. Then the list isn't just history, it becomes a cosmic map, showing human kingship synchronized with the universe's deepest rhythms. Other decodings are more earthly. Maybe a year in the list didn't mean a solar year. Maybe it represented a month or a season. Divide those colossal figures by 12. You get reigns of a few thousand years, still mythic but closer to a dynastic memory. Or maybe each king's name stood for an entire priestly lineage. His reign was the total duration his family line held a sacred office. The number becomes an administrative record, not a biography, but the most powerful interpretation is symbolic. The numbers before the flood are perfect. They are multiples of sacred numbers, 60, 360, 1,800. They speak of order. A universe in harmony, then the flood comes, and after the flood the numbers change. They become messier, 126 years, 187 years. They are no longer perfect multiples, they are fractured, human, imperfect. The mathematical shift tells the same story as the myth. The flood didn't just drown the land. It shattered a cosmic order. It introduced chaos into a once perfect system. The reigns of men could never again match the pristine, numerical harmony of the gods' time. So were the Sumerians hiding advanced astronomy in a king list, possibly, but more likely they were doing what humans have always done, using the tools they understood, mathematics, astronomy, to describe the indescribable. To give shape to the concept of a lost golden age, a time when heaven and earth were aligned and numbers were pure. The flood was the great dissonance. The moment the music of the spheres was broken, and every king who came after was trying and failing to count his way back to that lost harmony. This mathematical layer transforms the list. From a chronicle into a lament, a numerical poem about a fall from grace. But to truly hear that poem, we have to listen to the voices of the kings themselves. Not as numbers, but as characters in an epic drama. What do their names and their stories tell us about the world they ruled? The numbers tell one story, but the flood left another record. Not in clay tablets, but in the ground. To see it, you leave the library, you go to the dig site, you stop reading cuneiform and start reading soil. In the 1920s, Leonard Woolley was excavating His team dug deep and they hit something. Below the ruins of the Sumerian city, they found a layer, a thick, uniform deposit of clean clay, water-laid clay. It was sterile, no artifacts, no signs of life, and it separated two distinct periods of settlement. Woolley stood at the edge of that trench and made a declaration. He believed he'd found the physical evidence of the biblical flood. The flood, a capital F. It was a sensational find. It seemed to prove the myth was real. But archaeology gets more complicated the closer you look. Later excavations told a different story. At Shuruppak, the city the Sumerians named as the home of Ziusudra, the flood survivor, they found signs of a major inundation. A destructive layer of silt, dated to around 2900 BCE. At Kish, another royal center, similar evidence appeared, flood deposits from around the same period. The picture isn't a single globe-covering event. There's no universal flood layer across all of Mesopotamia. Instead, it points to a series of catastrophic floods. Region-wide, a perfect storm of factors, the Tigris and Euphrates prone to flooding, unleashed by heavy rainfall upstream or seismic activity that changed the rivers, or a shift in the Persian Gulf shoreline. The result would have been a disaster of unimaginable scale for the people living there, not a flood that covered the world, but one that covered their world. The entire alluvial plain, the cradle of their civilization, turned into an inland sea. For the communities scattered across that plain, the trauma would have been absolute. Collective survivors from different cities would have carried the same story. The waters rose without warning. They swallowed homes and temples and fields. They erased generations of work. When the waters receded, the landscape was remade. Old landmarks were gone. The soil itself was different. This was an event that didn't just damage property. It shattered a worldview. It forced a restart. This is where the dirt meets the poetry of the King List. The physical evidence grounds the myth in an environmental reality. Those repeated, catastrophic floods around 2900 BC provide the historical kernel, the genuine trauma. What the Sumerians did in their myths and their King List was process that trauma. They took a recurring natural disaster and condensed it into a single, pivotal event, the flood. It became the great divider, the moment that separated everything before from everything after. So the King List isn't recording a literal, year-long deluge. It's memorializing a profound break. a before and after so stark it could only be explained as the gods washing the slate clean. The list formalizes that memory. It takes the shared experience of loss and rebirth and weaves it into the structure of time and kingship. The flood layer in the soil at and Shuruppak is the physical echo. The line in the king list is the cultural scar. Together, they tell us this was real. The water rose, the world ended, and a new one began in its wake. But if the flood reshaped the land and the stories, what did it do to the people who ruled after? How did that trauma change the very idea of kingship? After the flood, the list continues, but the scale has shifted. The numbers are smaller now, a few hundred years, not tens of thousands. The cities are places we know, Kish, Uruk, and the kings who ruled them start to move out of pure myth and into something else, a kind of early history. The first major dynasty after the flood is Kish, and its most famous early king is Etana. The list says he ruled for 1,560 years, still an impossible length, but much shorter than before the flood. And Etana is remembered in stories as the shepherd who flew to heaven. He was childless, and to find a plant for birth, he rode on an eagle to the realm of the gods. It's a myth about a king reaching upward, but Kish is a real place. Archaeologists have found its layers from this early period, so Etana is at this crossroads. A name that probably belonged to a real ruler of Kish, with a celestial legend built around him later. The list holds him in that space, part remembered leader, part symbolic figure. Then there's Uruk and its most legendary king, Gilgamesh. The list gives him 126 years. He's the fifth king of Uruk's first dynasty. And here the link to archaeology gets stronger. We don't have proof of a man named Gilgamesh, but we have evidence of a powerful historical king of Uruk around 2600 BC. A king whose achievements were so large they grew into an epic over centuries. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a cultural memory. It tells of a tyrant king who befriends a wild man, Enkidu. They seek glory, defy the gods, and Gilgamesh faces mortality. His search for eternal life fails, but he gains wisdom. By putting Gilgamesh in the list with a specific reign length, the scribes were doing something deep. They were anchoring this huge literary figure into their official timeline. They were saying this hero, whose story touches our deepest fears, was one of us. He was a king. He connects our world to the older past. This is what the post-flood section does. It builds a bridge made of both stone and story. On one side is the unreachable, mythic age of the gods and the flood. On the other side is the documented, historical world of city-states and treaties that the scribes lived in. The list makes a walkway between them, using figures like Etana and Gilgamesh as supports. These kings are the connectors. They have legendary, superhuman qualities, but they ruled cities that left physical ruins. They performed miraculous feats, but their dynasties show a plausible sequence of power moving between Sumer's major cities. This wasn't careless fiction. It was a deliberate construction of identity. For the Sumerians, history had to be continuous. A break in the line of kings would be a break in the world's order. So even after a catastrophe that reset everything, the list insists on continuity. It says kingship came from heaven, it survived the flood, and it passed in an unbroken chain to the rulers of today. The myths attached to these early post-flood kings aren't distractions. They're the glue. They provide the divine sanction and the epic scale to make that bridge feel sacred and solid. So when we read of Gilgamesh's reign, we're not just reading a number. We're seeing a civilization stitching its soul together, merging its awe for the primordial past with the political realities of the present. The list claims that the king on the throne is the heir to Gilgamesh's Uruk, to Etana's Kish, and back further, to the pre-flood kings who spoke with the gods. It turns genealogy into theology. It turns chronology into a source of power. But this bridge leads to a new problem. As the list gets closer to the scribe's own time, the tension between its claims and verifiable reality would become impossible to ignore. The clay prism was made by someone, a scribe, in Mesopotamia. That was an elite profession, a path to real power. To see why the King List looks like it does, you have to picture the scribble schools. They were like the first universities. Boys, usually from wealthy families, spent years learning cuneiform. They practiced on clay tablets, learning hundreds of signs. They studied math, astronomy, law. They memorized the great myths like the flood story. These men became the archivists, the accountants, the diplomats. Their literacy set them apart. They were the keepers of all knowledge. So when a king wanted a document like the Sumerian King List, he went to these scholars. But they weren't just transcribing, they were composers. They had access to sources, city chronicles from Nippur and old victory monuments, oral poems about heroes like Gilgamesh. Their job was to take all these different strands, sometimes conflicting, and weave them into one story, one official narrative. That's the key, including the flood and those impossibly long reigns before it. That was a choice. A deliberate editorial decision. It was a theological statement made by these learned men. They sifted through the material and decided what was essential. The story they wanted to tell was about continuity, about divine sanction. Imagine them with their sources. A chronicle from Kish lists early kings with reigns of hundreds of years. A hymn from Eridu talks about a time when gods ruled for eras. A popular tale tells of a great deluge that wiped the land clean. The scribe's genius was to synthesize this, to create a timeline that started with the gods, survived the catastrophe, and flowed right into the historical dynasties of their own time. They were crafting an identity for a region often divided by rival cities. The list said, before we were from or Uruk, we were all survivors of the same flood. We all descend from the same line of kingship given by heaven. That's a powerful unifying myth, and the format, the prism, the repetitive structure, that was intentional too. It gave the list an air of authority. It looked like an administrative record, which made its extraordinary claims feel factual. By writing it down, they turned fluid oral traditions into fixed official history. So the Sumerian King List isn't a window into pure history. It's a curated product. A piece of early historiography, shaped by scribes to make sense of a chaotic past for the needs of a complex present. They used scholarship and myth to answer deep questions. Where did we come from? Why do we have kings? How did we survive the wrath of the gods? The list was their answer, baked into clay. But to see the full picture, you have to look beyond Sumer's borders, to where this story found a parallel. The scribes in Sumer named the flood. They gave it a date, but the hero of that story, he kept changing. The first one was Ziusudra, a wise king from the old Sumerian tales. His name means he of long life. He gets a warning through the wall of his reed hut. He builds a great boat and he's granted immortality. That was the original, the template, but then the story traveled and it changed. The Akkadians told it next. They dominated Mesopotamia later. Their hero was Atrahasis. Exceedingly wise, in his epic, the god's motive is clearer. Humanity has multiplied. The noise is a constant din. It keeps the chief god Enlil from sleeping. So the flood becomes a solution, a desperate, brutal solution to overpopulation. And again, the clever god of the waters, Enki, he subverts the plan. He tells Atrahasis to build a circular coracle, to save his family, to save the animals. The parallels to Ziusudra are deep. It's the same story, just retold for a new audience in their own language. Then this hero appears a third time, in the world's oldest great epic, in the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh. There, the survivor is Utnapishtim. Gilgamesh is seeking eternal life. He journeys to find him, and Utnapishtim recounts the tale. The details are familiar. Hauntingly familiar, the secret council of the gods, the warning from that's the Babylonian name for Enki, the building of a massive vessel, cube-shaped. The terrible storm, 6 days and 7 nights, sending out the dove, the swallow, the raven, the offering on the mountain. For his obedience, Utnapishtim and his wife are granted eternal life. They become like gods. That version is a masterpiece, but its bones are the old Sumerian myth. It shows how a foundational story was preserved and polished. Across generations now cross a frontier, a cultural one. To the west, in the Hebrew Bible, the story of Noah unfolds. The structure is the same, unmistakably. A righteous man is chosen. He gets precise instructions to build an ark. He gathers his family, pairs of every animal. A great flood covers the earth. He sends out a raven and a dove. The ark rests on a mountain. Noah makes a sacrifice, and a covenant is established, symbolized by the rainbow. But here, the divine motive shifts. Profoundly, it's not human noise, it's not overpopulation, it's human wickedness and violence. The moral framework is different. The flood becomes an act of judgment. Moral judgment and purification, followed by a new covenant between God and all living things. This comparative journey reveals something extraordinary. A single core narrative of survival, rooted in the Mesopotamian floodplain. It traveled, it was adapted, translated, reinterpreted. The Sumerian king became the Akkadian wise man, who became the Babylonian immortal, who became the Hebrew patriarch. Each culture molded the hero to fit its own worldview. The Sumerians and Babylonians framed it within a pantheon, squabbling human-like gods. The Hebrew tradition framed it within a theology, one sovereign moral deity, but the heart of the story stays, the warning. The vessel, the preservation of life, the new beginning that remains intact across all versions. And this is where the King List does its work, its unique magic. The epics of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, they're poetic. The King List is prosaic, it's administrative, by inserting the flood as a single entry, a terse entry in a formal chronology. It does something the poems alone cannot. It anchors this powerful, evolving myth to a specific point in a structured timeline. It gives the event a historical weight. A bureaucratic reality. The list says this was not just a story we tell. It was an epoch that ended, a line drawn in the clay of history. Before it, one kind of time. After it, another. By doing this, the Sumerian scribes provided the bedrock upon which all the later adaptations could be built, the poetic ones. The theological ones, they turned a traumatic memory into a historical fact, and that fact became a seed that grew in countless directions. The enduring power of the flood story across millennia, it may well spring from this dual nature. It was both a profound myth about human fragility and a recorded event in humanity's oldest ledger. Kingship came down from heaven. That was the starting point. It wasn't a metaphor, it was just a fact. The universe was a balance the gods kept, but they weren't here among people day to day. They needed someone. A steward, that was the king. His job was to mediate, to stand between the divine and the human. He did the rituals, he ran the temples, he made sure the gods got their offerings. And in return, the gods would provide the river's flood which made the crops grow, victory, stability. This order had a name, the divine decrees. The blueprints for everything, kingship, truth, law, carpentry, weaving. The king was the guardian of that. His rule was a form of maintenance, cosmic maintenance. So then you look at those first kings, the ones before the flood. Their reigns aren't just long, they're perfectly long. 28,800 years. 36,000 years. These aren't human life stories, they're theological claims. If the king is the direct agent of the gods, then his rule should reflect the divine. It should be timeless. Those huge numbers lift those first 8 kings right out of history. they become something else, administrators almost divine. Being so close to the source that their time on earth lasts for epochs, they are shown as extensions of the God's will, presiding over a world in perfect harmony. A golden age, the me was fully intact, the connection between heaven and earth was direct, unobstructed. Then came the flood. In this framework, the flood isn't a storm. It's a reset, a divine reset. The cosmic order failed. The Sumerian story is clear. Humanity had gotten too loud, too numerous. They disturbed the gods. The flood was to wipe the slate clean, the ultimate consequence. The direct divine administration of that early era had failed, so the gods washed it all away. That's the pivotal break in the King List. The moment the direct link was cut, after the waters go down, kingship is brought back, the list continues. But everything is different. The reigns get shorter, a few hundred years, then 100, then just decades. The descent is clear. The kings after the flood are still intermediaries, but the connection is more distant. More fragile, they're heroic like Gilgamesh, but they're also flawed, mortal. They try to uphold the me, but they're in a world that's been scarred. Fundamentally scarred, the flood created a buffer, a layer of trauma between people and the divine. So the list, in its quiet way, with just numbers, is tracking the evolution of sacred rule. From divine proxies in a perfect world to heroic mortals trying to rebuild in a broken one, it's a story of loss, a slow fading of that first golden light. The king is still the shepherd, but after the flood, he's shepherding through a long shadow, a shadow cast by the very waters that remade the world. And if the king's authority came from keeping a cosmic balance, then his biggest challenge was a physical one. Controlling the waters, the same waters that had once delivered divine judgment. The Weld-Blundell prism is just one version. There are others. Copies of this king list have been found all over Mesopotamia, and they don't always match. A version from Nippur might give a pre-flood king a different name. A tablet from Lhasa might only list 7 pre-flood rulers, not 8. Even the order of the cities, which one held kingship after another, that shifts. Kish might come before Uruk in one list, but after it in another. These aren't mistakes, they're edits, deliberate ones, political edits. You have to imagine each major city with its own scriptorium, its own scribble tradition. When the king of Isin wanted a copy made, his scribes would work from their own archives. They'd emphasize the parts of the story that made Isin seem central. They might adjust the sequence of cities to suggest a more legitimate transfer of power, one that led naturally to their own ruler. A city like with its own proud history, would produce a version that highlighted its dynasties. So the list was a living document, constantly updated, constantly tweaked to serve the present. It was less a fixed history and more a tool in a debate. A cultural debate about who held the truest claim to Sumer's legacy. This fact that there's no single authoritative text, that's what makes the king list so valuable. The discrepancies are a feature. They reveal the competition, the vibrant competition between city-states, each one vying to control the narrative of the past. It shows us that history, even 4,000 years ago, was a contested space. It was about persuasion, using the weight of antiquity to justify modern power. The different versions are like multiple drafts of a founding story, each draft favoring a different author. So asking for the true list is the wrong question. There is no single truth etched in clay. Instead, you have a chorus of voices, all singing a similar song, but each in a slightly different key. They agree on the fundamental framework: kingship from heaven, the catastrophic flood, the succession of cities. But the precise details were negotiable. That fluidity reminds us the past was always a story being told, shaped by the needs and rivalries of the people telling it. The act of copying the list was itself an act of interpretation, placing your city, your king, into that grand, divine timeline. and that struggle to own the narrative, it leads to one final layer. A haunting one. What if this competition to control the past explains the list's most enduring mystery, those impossible pre-flood reign lengths? The King List isn't a timeline. It's a poem written in the language of cities and of reigns, and its structure shows you a worldview where history wasn't a march forward, it was a great wheel. A wheel that turns, so the list gives you kings, but it also gives you a pattern. A city rises, it holds kingship, its rulers come one after another. Then the list says the kingship was taken to another city. The focus shifts, the old center fades, a new one takes its place. That's the cycle. Hegemony, then decline, then transfer. Again and again, it's the rhythm of their history, a rhythm without final victory, without permanent glory, just the endless turning of fortune's wheel. And into this cycle, the list places the ultimate interruption, the flood. This isn't just another city falling, it's the cosmos hitting the reset button. The wheel stops, everything is washed clean, and then it starts again. Kingship is brought down once more. The cycle resumes, but now everything is different. The reigns are shorter, the connection feels more fragile. This structure, the cycle, and then the catastrophe, it's a profound theme. It tells us how the Sumerians saw their place in the world. They lived in a volatile land between two unpredictable rivers. One bad flood could erase a harvest, an invasion could topple a dynasty. Their world was unstable. The King List takes that lived experience, that uncertainty, and it elevates it to a cosmic principle. Human endeavor is temporary, cities are temporary. All glory is fleeting, even the golden age before the flood was swept away. But then there's the second theme, persistence. Kingship itself survives. The institution, the divine gift, it endures. The flood does not end the story. It begins a new chapter. This narrative of destruction and then renewal, it would have been deeply consoling. To a people who knew their walls could be breached, their fields drowned, their gods seemingly angry, the list offered a message. Yes, catastrophe comes. It has come before, it will come again, but the order of things, the very idea of civilization, in kingship it persists, it is reborn, the list is an anchor. In a chaotic world, it provided continuity. It said, we have been here before, we have faced the total end, and we rebuilt. Our story did not stop, so your city may fall, but kingship will find a new home. Your dynasty may end, but the line continues. That's the literary genius of it. It transforms a chronicle of names into a meditation on resilience. It uses that repetitive listing of cities and years to lull you into a rhythm. The rhythm of eternity, a rhythm that absorbs even the greatest shock. The flood becomes not just a disaster, but a necessary part of the cycle, the great cleansing that lets the wheel turn once more. To read the list this way is to hear their anxiety and the profound hope they made from their own history. They looked at the ruins of older cities and saw not just failure, but precedent. They looked at the river that could destroy them and saw, in its mythic fury, the very event that made their world possible. The list is their answer to chaos. A story in clay, insisting that order, however fragile, always returns. That hope for a resilient story is why the Sumerian King List doesn't just stay in the past. It has a modern afterlife. In the 20th and 21st centuries, it found a new audience, not archaeologists, storytellers, writers and researchers in alternative history looked at those immense reign lengths. They didn't see myth, they saw a hidden truth. The most famous interpretation comes from the ancient astronaut theory. That view says the pre-flood kings, with reigns of tens of thousands of years, weren't human. They were extraterrestrial visitors, or maybe human-alien hybrids. Their incredible lifespans are read as a sign of advanced alien biology or technology. In that framework, the flood becomes a planetary catastrophe, maybe even a war between alien factions. something that wiped out that first guided civilization. The theory offers a simple answer. The numbers are literal, the gods were astronauts. Our history is a sequel to an older, interstellar drama. It's a compelling narrative. It turns the list from a cryptic chronicle into a user manual for a forgotten epoch, and it speaks to a modern desire, the desire for a past that's more extraordinary, more technologically advanced than our linear history suggests. It turns mystery into spectacle. The appeal is understandable. Faced with the silent ruins of Göbekli Tepe or the precision of the pyramids, the idea of a lost, superior civilization provides a neat solution. The King List, with its stark numerical strangeness, fits perfectly into that puzzle. Mainstream scholarship approaches the list from a different angle. Historians and archaeologists like Thorkild Jacobsen or Jean-Jacques Glasner don't see a literal record. They see a literary and political artifact. Their work involves textual analysis, comparing different versions of the list, studying the language, the formulaic phrases. They place it alongside other Mesopotamian documents, economic tablets, legal codes, royal inscriptions. To understand its context, archaeology provides the physical setting. The flood layers at and Shuruppak show a real environmental trauma, but not a global one. The cultural context reveals a society deeply concerned with divine order, with legitimizing rulership, with using the past to stabilize the present. From this vantage point, the long reigns are symbolic. They're a way to express the unimaginable antiquity of kingship itself, to lift the origins of civilization into a sacred, timeless realm. The shift after the flood reflects a common mythological theme, a fall from a primordial golden age into the harsher, more familiar world of human limits. The scholarly interpretation is less about hidden aliens. It's more about understanding how the Sumerians themselves thought about time and power, their place in the cosmos. It's complex, nuanced, often less sensational. This contrast isn't really about who's right and who's wrong. It's about what we seek when we look at ancient texts. The ancient astronaut theory offers a specific kind of answer. It satisfies a hunger for dramatic revelation, for a history filled with forgotten high technology and cosmic connections. It makes the past feel knowable in a thrilling, cinematic way. Academic scholarship offers a different kind of knowledge. It seeks to understand the Sumerian mind, to hear the list as its creators might have intended. This path is slower. It accepts ambiguity. It finds meaning not in secrets but in symbolism, not in literal events but in cultural expression. The enduring power of the King List is that it serves as a kind of Rorschach test. What we see in its numbers reveals our own hopes and anxieties about the human story. Do we want our origins to be miraculous, guided by superior beings from the stars, or do we find a deeper wonder in the sheer ingenuity of early humans? Crafting such an elegant myth to explain their fragile world, the list in its silent, numerical way supports both readings. It's a testament to its own genius. That 4,000 years later, we're still decoding its message, and in doing so, decoding our own desire to find something extraordinary in our beginnings. The words they used to write the list, the actual words, they hold secrets. To get the numbers, you have to understand Sumerian. It was a language isolate completely on its own. And the way it was built shaped how they saw things, especially time, especially numbers. Their number system was base 60, what we call sexagesimal. We still see it: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. That system made certain numbers feel complete. Sacred, a sar was 3,600 years, that's 60 times 60. A ner was 600 years, 10 times 60. These weren't random, they were building blocks. A kind of cosmic mathematics. So when the list says a king ruled for 8 sars, it's saying 28,800 years. That's a statement of perfection. A reign that fits into the divine architecture. It's less a biography and more a theological equation. The huge lengths come from this mathematical framework. They're expressions of an ideal, written in the only numerical language they had for vast, sacred time. Then there's the word for the event, the flood. In Sumerian, it's Amaru. That word carries a weight. A simple translation like flood misses it. It implies an overwhelming, cataclysmic deluge, a force that doesn't just rise but sweeps everything away. It's a word of total transformation. By choosing Amaru for that one line in the list, the scribes were doing more than recording a disaster. They were invoking a concept. The ultimate reset. The word itself becomes a boundary marker. The mediums shape the message too. Cuneiform script. It's not like cursive. It's made by pressing a wedge-shaped reed into soft clay. It's deliberate, physical. Each sign takes effort that encouraged a concise, formulaic style. You wouldn't write long descriptions on a small clay prism. You'd write declarations, monumental statements, the repetitive pattern of the King List city, king years. It's a perfect fit. It has the rhythm of a chant. A sacred incantation. This wasn't the format for debating sources. It was for etching a truth into permanence. The act of writing it in cuneiform, of baking the clay hard, was an act of making the story solid. Official, unchangeable. So looking at the list through language, it starts to demystify itself. The huge numbers aren't a puzzle to be solved literally. They're the natural output of a culture that thought in base 60 and expressed divine concepts through mathematical perfection. The terse, repetitive format isn't a lack of detail. It's the signature of a writing system built for recording eternal verities, not daily diaries. The scribes weren't trying to fool anyone with fake years. They were using all the tools they had to construct something more important than fact. They were building a foundation myth for civilization itself. A myth written in the only language that could make it feel timeless. The language of numbers, of sacred words, of clay made permanent by fire. This perspective doesn't diminish the list. It deepens the respect for the world that created it. A world where mathematics, writing, and theology were woven into a single tool for defining reality. And that tool was used not just to record kings, but to answer the most profound question. Where does order come from in a world so prone to chaos? That memory held in clay didn't fade. It became the foundation. The empires that came after Sumer, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, they took that framework, the King List, and they made it their own. They wrote their own lists, their own chronicles, but the template was already there. Kingship was still a gift from the gods. History was still told in dynasties, rising and falling. And the flood that stayed as the great turning point, the pivot in the deep past. This wasn't just copying records, it was inheritance. By taking that timeline, these later powers claimed legitimacy. They placed their own kings into that line of succession. They became the latest heirs in a chain that went back to before the flood. The story became part of who they were. The flood narrative especially, it spread everywhere in Mesopotamian thought for thousands of years. It wasn't just in the epics. It showed up in omen texts where a priest might see a warning of a deluge in a sheep's liver or in the flight of birds. It was in literary works. It was in school exercises where a young scribe would practice by writing out passages about the great waters, and kings used it. In their inscriptions, boasting of their deeds, they'd connect themselves to that ancient survival. They presented themselves as keepers of order against chaos, just like the gods restored order after the Amaru swept everything away. That led to one of the most compelling ideas to come out of this, the idea of antediluvian wisdom. If the world before the flood was a golden age closer to the gods, then the knowledge from that time had to be profound. Secret knowledge, divine. Kings and scholars started to believe the sages from that lost age had inscribed their insights on stone tablets, tablets that survived the flood. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC, he boasted in his library inscriptions that he could read stone inscriptions from before the flood. That wasn't just a claim about reading. It was a claim to power. By accessing wisdom from before the catastrophe, he was tapping into a pure source. He was linking his rule to the very foundation of the world. So the King List did more than record names. It created a way of seeing. It built a cultural memory that defined what it meant to be Mesopotamian. Their identity became rooted in a story of survival, of resilience. They were the people who endured the reset. Their civilization was the second act, built with the hard-won wisdom of the first. This story provided a sense of continuity in a place often broken by violent change. Even as empires rose, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, they all saw themselves as part of one unbroken stream. The list told them they were special. They had a unique link to the primordial past. A past that held secrets later rulers could still hope to uncover. That legacy leaves a final question. If this story was so powerful, so definitive for an entire civilization, what does its persistence tell us about how we think? Why does this pattern, a lost golden age, a catastrophic flood, a survivor carrying knowledge forward, why does it resonate so deeply across time and culture? The answer might not be in the clay of Mesopotamia. It might be in the shared architecture of memory itself. Geology has its own record, layers of sediment, ancient shorelines. There's a theory about the Black Sea. Around 5,600 BC, the Mediterranean is thought to have broken through at the Bosporus. A natural dam gave way. And then came a catastrophic inflow, a wall of saltwater pouring into a freshwater basin. The Black Sea's shoreline would have moved back miles every day. It swallowed the coastal plains where early farmers lived. For them, it was the end of their world, an inland sea turning into an ocean overnight. Researchers like William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed this. It's a vivid candidate for a historical flood, an epic one. Stories from that could have been carried by refugees in all directions, maybe even into Mesopotamia. But other scientists look closer to home, to the Tigris and Euphrates system itself. It's a volatile place. Geological cores show evidence, repeated massive floods across that plain. A perfect convergence could do it. Heavy rainfall in the highlands, seismic activity shifting the rivers, a high water table that could produce a flood of biblical scale. Not one event, but a series, each one layering trauma onto cultural memory. That would explain the flood layers found at different cities, Shuruppak. Dated to different centuries, the myth wouldn't come from one flood. It would come from the essence of life there, between two unpredictable rivers. This debate points to a psychological insight. The global consistency of the flood myth. Could it be a cultural fossil, a deep memory of sea level rise after the last ice age, between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago? Glaciers melted, coastlines vanished everywhere. What were inhabited plains became continental shelves. For generations of coastal people, the ocean was this relentless, advancing force. An apocalypse in slow motion, but fast enough to be witnessed within a community's oral history. That shared experience of loss, a drowned world, it could have been passed down for thousands of years. Evolving into the story of a divine deluge, the Sumerian King List processes this deep memory. It doesn't just tell the story, it dates it, it contextualizes it. By placing the flood at that precise juncture between mythic time and historical time, the scribes performed an act of synthesis. They took an environmental trauma, whether local flooding or a memory of rising seas, and wove it into their civilization's identity. The flood became the definitive break, what separated the age of the gods from the age of men. They transformed a terrifying natural event into a meaningful historical pivot. It was no longer just something that happened. It was the thing that explained why their world was the way it was. This blend shows the Sumerian mind at work. They weren't just victims of their landscape, they were interpreters of it. They took the literal clay from their floods and formed a narrative of renewal. The King List is that narrative's backbone. It argues that even the greatest catastrophe has a place in the order. It's a record, but more than that, it's an argument for resilience. An argument written not against the waters, but with the very silt they left behind. The gods here aren't a single will, they're a council, a kind of divine bureaucracy. Enlil is the chief god, he presides, and the problem, according to the texts, isn't human wickedness, it's human noise. The people have multiplied, their clamor is a constant din. It disturbs Enlil's rest, so in this framework the flood isn't an act of moral judgment, it's a practical solution, an administrative decision to restore quiet to the cosmos. The motivation is startling in its mundanity. It removes that moral dimension you see later. This isn't about punishing sin, it's about solving a nuisance. Enki, the god of wisdom and waters, he sees the flaw in the plan. He doesn't see humanity as a problem to be erased. He values their craft, their labor. But he's bound by the council's decree, so he works around it. He speaks not to the king, Ziusudra, but to the wall of his reed hut, a technicality, a loophole in divine law. That act frames the universe. It's not ruled by a single, inscrutable deity. It's a place of divine politics, competing agendas, clever subversion. The survival of humanity hinges on a bureaucratic ruse. That changes everything about the flood's meaning. It's not a righteous purge. It's a catastrophic overreaction mitigated by one god's compassion and cunning. The renewal that follows is distinct too. After the waters recede, Ziusudra doesn't receive a covenant or a promise. He offers a sacrifice. The sweet smell draws the gods who'd been starving without human offerings. They gather like flies, the text says. Enlil, initially enraged to see survivors, is appeased by the sacrifice and by Enki's reasoning. Instead of a new contract with humanity, the reward is personal. Ziusudra and his wife are granted eternal life. They're taken to live in the distant, blessed land of Dilmun. Salvation is individual, not collective. The world repopulates, but under no new divine guarantee. The gods have simply decided, for now, to tolerate humanity again. This is the theological world the Sumerian King List operates within. By placing the flood as the central pivot, the list is making a statement about this divine order. It shows the gods' plans can be chaotic, even self-contradicting. Yet, through it all, one institution survives intact: kingship. The list asserts that kingship itself, the divine gift of governance, endures the gods' own fit of chaos. It's the resilient thread. The gods may send a flood to wipe the slate clean, but the concept of a king mediating between heaven and earth is so essential it must be reinstated. The list, in its dry chronology, encapsulates a universe where the divine is not perfectly good nor perfectly just, but where a fundamental structure for human society persists. It offers a theology of resilient order emerging from divine unpredictability. The king, therefore, isn't just a ruler. He's the necessary anchor in a cosmos where even the gods can make disastrous mistakes. The clay prism is cracked. Some of the cuneiform signs are worn away. There are gaps. A city's name is lost. A reign length is unreadable. And even when the text is complete, there are kings listed who appear nowhere else. Their names only echo in this one document. These aren't just copying errors, they're silences in the story. The Sumerian King List presents a seamless chronicle, but its surface is marked by these absences. These uncertainties, one of the most significant is called the problem of Kish. After the flood, the list says kingship was taken to Kish. Then it names over 20 kings who ruled there, with reigns still in the hundreds of years. But archaeology tells a complicated story. Kish was a powerful northern center. Yet the sheer length of this dynasty, its exclusivity in the list, suggests something more. It may represent a competing tradition, a separate northern Mesopotamian lineage of rule. The southern Sumerian scribes, who likely compiled the list, felt compelled to incorporate it. They couldn't ignore Kish's prestige, so they wove its rulers into their narrative, but the seam is visible. The list tries to force a linear sequence, first Kish, then Uruk, then But in reality, these cities were often contemporaries, rivals jockeying for power at the same time. That neat procession is an editorial choice, creating order from a messy, overlapping political reality. These gaps and contradictions aren't failures of the ancient historians. They're quiet invitations. They remind us this document is a reconstruction. It's an ancient scholar's best attempt, working maybe 4,000 years ago, to create a coherent whole from sources that were already old, fragmentary. Often contradictory, they had local chronicles from different cities, each promoting its own heroes. They had oral poems that blurred the lines between kings and gods. Their task was to synthesize all of it into one authoritative timeline. Where they faced a blank space in their sources, they may have left a blank space on the prism. Where two traditions conflicted, they made a choice, prioritizing one narrative thread over another. This makes the list not a window into pure history, but a window into the ancient art of history writing itself. It's a testament to a deep human drive, the drive to take the scattered pieces of the past, the faded memories, the broken monuments, the conflicting claims, and assemble them into a story that makes sense. To find a pattern in the chaos, to declare that even after a cataclysm like the flood, the thread of civilization was not lost. It could be traced hand over hand back to the very beginning. The uncertainties in the list, therefore, aren't flaws to be dismissed. They're the most honest parts. They show the scribes at work, grappling with the same problem every historian faces: how to build a narrative from an incomplete record. Their solution was to create a framework so powerful, so resonant with divine order, that it could hold these fragments together. It could make room for the kings of Kish and the heroes of Uruk, for the impossibly long reigns and the historical figures, all within one sweeping arc of time. That arc leads to a final thought. If the list is a crafted narrative, built to answer deep questions about order and survival, then what does its enduring power say about the stories we still tell today to explain our own world? This impulse to anchor power in deep time, it wasn't just Sumer. You look across the ancient world and you see the same pattern. Kings and scribes, from the Nile to the Yellow River, they were all crafting these documents. Long lists of rulers stretching back into a hazy, mythic past. In Egypt there was the Palamo stone, a fragment of black basalt carved with the annals of the earliest pharaohs. It records names, years, the height of the Nile's annual flood, significant events. It blends what we'd call history, wars, temple foundations, with what we'd call myth, listing gods as the first rulers before mortal pharaohs took the throne. The purpose was the same as the Sumerian prism: to legitimize, to show the current pharaoh as the latest link in an unbroken chain that began with the gods. It turned political authority into a cosmic constant. Far to the east in China, early historians compiled accounts of the 3 sovereigns and the 5 emperors. Sage kings from the dawn of time, credited with inventing agriculture, writing, medicine, social order. Their reigns were described as immensely long, peaceful, a golden age of perfect virtue. Later dynasties like the Zhou and the Han traced their legitimacy back to these figures by claiming descent or a philosophical inheritance from the Yellow Emperor or Yao and Shun. A ruler was saying his mandate was ancient. Natural, morally sanctioned, it was a different cultural language but the same foundational story. A story that said, our rule is not new, it is the restoration of a primordial ideal. You see this from the Maya with their long count calendar anchoring kings to cosmic cycles, to the Hindu Puranas with their lists of Manvantaras, vast ages presided over by primal beings. These lists were never just administrative records, they were the bedrock of identity. They answered the fundamental questions: where do we come from? Why are we ruled this way? The answer was always found in a deep, often divinely touched past. This global perspective is crucial. It tells us the Sumerians weren't strange for creating their king list. They were part of a universal human practice. The need to root the present in a storied past, it seems to be a hallmark of early statehood. It's how a culture transforms power from mere force into something sacred. Enduring, yet within this common tradition, the Sumerian list stands out for one bold choice. While other king lists often move seamlessly from gods to heroes to historical rulers, the Sumerian scribes inserted a catastrophic break. A literal line in the clay, then the flood swept over. They chose a single, cataclysmic event as the definitive pivot point of all history. The Egyptian lists speak of the Nile's cyclical floods, a source of life. The Chinese lists speak of peaceful abdication, one virtuous emperor to another, but the Sumerians centered their timeline on an act of divine near annihilation. This makes their effort uniquely vivid. It acknowledges a trauma, a clean break before the work of rebuilding could begin. Their list doesn't just claim continuity, it acknowledges a profound discontinuity first, and then shows how kingship survived it. That narrative of survival through catastrophe may be their most enduring legacy. It presents civilization not as a given, but as a hard-won achievement. Rescued from the waters and painstakingly rebuilt, reign by reign, in the long shadow of the deluge. The flood is a punctuation mark in the story of time. It's the ultimate full stop, and then a new paragraph begins. For the scribes writing the king list, this was more than a memory of water. It was a literary solution. They had a problem. Their culture told of gods walking the earth, of kings who ruled for epochs, but they lived in a world of mortal rulers, short reigns. Fragile city walls. So how do you connect those two things? How do you build a bridge from the mythic to the historical without that bridge collapsing? The flood was the answer. It was the controlled demolition. By placing that single cataclysm at the heart of their chronology, they created a clean break. A narrative caesura. Everything before the flood could belong to the time of origins, a realm where 36,000-year reigns weren't just possible, they were expected. That was the age of the gods, a prologue written in a different kind of time. Then the waters rose, and they washed all of that away. They erased the conditions that made those immense reigns possible. When the waters receded, the world was new, different. The slate was literally clean. Now history could begin again, but on new terms. Terms the Sumerians of the 2nd millennium BC could recognize. The reigns after the flood are still long, but they're hundreds of years, not tens of thousands. They're heroic, but they're human. The flood allowed for a believable transition. It solved continuity by introducing discontinuity. It said the old world is gone, but its most important principle, kingship, survived the journey. This was a masterstroke of historical editing. It turned a potential weakness, the unbelievable length of the early reigns, into a strength. Those immense numbers now served a purpose. They highlighted the sheer power of the catastrophe that ended them. The greater the golden age, the more profound the reset. And this narrative device proved so powerful, so resonant, that it was borrowed for millennia. Later cultures facing their own gaps between myth and history found the same tool useful. A great fire, a great famine, a great invasion. Any cataclysm could serve as that reset point. But the Sumerian model, with its world-covering deluge, set the standard. It provided a template for making the past comprehensible, for taking the chaotic memories of deep time and organizing them into a before and an after. This wasn't deception, it was meaning-making. The flood in the King List is more than an ancient weather report. It's the hinge the entire story turns on. It's the mechanism that lets the mythic flow into the historical, granting the kings of the present day a legitimacy that stretches back, not just through years, but through the very waters of creation. The most solid details in the list are the biggest puzzles, not the gaps, those specific, immense numbers for the pre-flood kings. 28,800 years. 36,000, that precision is the mystery. It suggests calculation, not random invention, and that leads to an idea, a single lost source, a primordial text. Maybe inscribed on stone, like Ashurbanipal later claimed to have. Could all the later clay copies be descendants of one original chronicle, something from a time closer to the events it described? We may never know, but the consistency in the core numbers across different versions points to a stable tradition, passed down with care for millennia. Then there's the post-flood section, where the list begins to touch the world we recognize. How much can be verified? Names like Gilgamesh of Uruk, Mesopotamian of Ur. They emerge from legend into the light of archaeology. Inscriptions confirm them, monuments, economic records. These were real rulers, real dynasties. Yet their reign lengths in the list are still centuries long. They defy ordinary human limits. This is where legend and history perform their dance. The list provides a skeleton. A sequence of cities and names that often aligns with the evidence, the rising and falling powers, but it clothes that skeleton in mythic flesh, superhuman duration. Turning historical kings into epic heroes, the transition is gradual, a slow fading from the symbolic to the plausible, and pinpointing the exact moment where one becomes the other is perhaps the list's most clever illusion. Beyond the kings, the nature of the flood event invites wider speculation. Could it encode a memory of something more dramatic than river flooding? Some researchers look to geological cataclysms. Something that shook the entire region, a massive volcanic eruption, like the one at Thera centuries later, that could have caused years of climate chaos. Failed harvests, stories of a sky raining fire and ash later remembered as water. Others point to a comet impact, an airburst, an event that could have flattened cities and triggered secondary flooding, leaving a scar on collective memory so deep it could only be described as the gods washing the world clean. These are speculative threads, but they speak to an urge to find a cause monumental enough to match the scale of the myth. These unanswered questions aren't a failure of scholarship. They're the engine of the list's enduring fascination. It resists every attempt at a single, neat explanation. It stands at a crossroads. One path leads to archaeology, the hard evidence of flood layers and city ruins. Another wins into mythology, the human need for foundational stories. A third extends into literature, the list as a crafted narrative, a progenitor of historical writing. And a fourth reaches toward astronomy, geology, the sciences of deep time. The Sumerian King List belongs to all these disciplines, yet is mastered by none. That resistance to categorization is its greatest strength. It remains a source of discovery because it is a mirror. What we see in its cryptic lines reflects our own changing questions. About time, memory, the origins of our world, the list doesn't give answers. It invites us to continue the search. That final question is where the prism's power really is. The Sumerian King List, it's not a puzzle, it's a mirror. For all that talk of divine kings and cosmic cycles, it shows us something human. It shows a civilization like ours trying to answer the basic questions. Where did we come from? Why does order fall apart? How do you find meaning after the floodwaters go down? Those scribes pressing signs into clay, they weren't just writing history. They were building a raft of story to carry who they were across time. They took the trauma of their land, the unpredictable rivers, the failed crops, the memory of a world drowned, and they made it into a story of survival. They made catastrophe a cornerstone. That's the list's big lesson. The past isn't a set of facts just waiting to be found. It's a story we keep telling ourselves with whatever we have on hand. For the Sumerians, that was clay and myth and the mathematics of the sky. They wove those together into a tapestry that gave their kings legitimacy. It gave their people a shared beginning. It gave their fragile world a place in a larger order and the link to the Great Flood. That's the brilliant stroke right at the center. It's the dramatic break that makes the story work. It allows for a lost golden age and a harder, more human world born from it. In doing that, it creates a template for resilience. A message, it says, even when the gods send the waters, something lasts. That something is the story itself. The need to record, to remember, to line up names in a sequence that says, we were here and we will be here again. Now we make our own king lists. We call them timelines, databases, historical records. We ground our modern identities in national histories, in scientific origin stories, in digital archives. The medium changed from clay to silicon, but the impulse didn't. We're still building narratives to explain where we are, to make our present legitimate by tying it to a meaningful past. The Sumerian King List, in all its strange beauty, reminds us that this isn't a flaw. It's the core of culture. It's how we make a home in time. So next time you see a timeline, or read a history book, or even scroll through a feed chronicling events, remember that 4,000-year-old prism. Remember, we're all, in a way, the scribes of our own age. We're all taking the fragments of our experience, the floods, big and small, and we're assembling them into a story that makes sense. The list's final gift is that invitation to reflect. It asks us to look at the stories we tell about our own world. What are our foundational cataclysms? What are our origin myths? And what do we believe is tough enough to survive whatever comes next?